Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation today, please type them into the Q&A icon on your Zoom toolbar, and we'll get to them at the end of each presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. Morning, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to the March 5th edition of CropTalk. And this week's edition, we are going to be talking some resistant management and of some of our grassy weeds, wild oats, and other grassy weeds. I think it's good to start talking about some of this stuff now because I think a lot of producers are starting to plan ahead already. I know the weather has been pretty decent lately as compared to where we were. I was out for a drive the other day and was down south of Brandon, and it's amazing the amount of snow that has left some of those areas compared to when you travel north, and the amount of snow that's still up in this area. So I think there's going to be producers getting a little itchy. I know I talked to some guys that are starting to talk about spring already and things that they're planning on doing. So again, planning ahead is a good thing. So it's a good opportunity to get Kim on right now and talk about managing some of our grassy weeds and some of the resistant issues that we're seeing in grassy weeds. And, we always get questions in the spring. I've got some resistance issues, and it could come down to a crop selection or just a different way of farming the land. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kim and let Kim start her presentation.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Can you guys see that okay?
You bet.
Okay, I'm just going to get my pointer a little bit nicer. And yeah, okay, so thanks very much, Lionel, for having me on today, and thanks everybody for listening. And yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about herbicide resistance and management in wild oats and other grassy weeds, because I don't get to talk a lot about these things sometimes. I do get to talk about wild oats a little bit, especially after last year because it was such a wild oat year. But sometimes, we get caught up. I talk a lot about kochia and water hemp and some other things. And so I just thought this was an opportunity to get some more information out there. And, at least I want everybody to know that this information is available. And, again, it's a good time to get guys thinking about spring. I agree with you, Lionel. I went to Saskatoon last week, and I went up 16 Highway and came back down through Regina and straight across kind of southern Manitoba there. And there's a lot of snow has disappeared lately, especially in that warm weather. I was surprised, especially in the southern part of the province, how much snow has disappeared. So we, hopefully we're heading into a nice early spring. Anyways, going forward, starting with my first slide, you guys have seen this before from me because this is not new, and I think that's not new either, the fact that there's nothing new. There hasn't been anything new for a very long time. So this is a chart of the introduction time of new herbicide sites of action based on the 8-track codes, and we see over the years going back as far as the 1940s, if you can see here on my screen where I'm showing you, we have Group 4s, MSCPA and 2,4-D have been around since basically the end of World War II, and we've been using them in agriculture basically unchanged for the last 80 years. Going forward through all these years, we start seeing all of these herbicide groups are being discovered. This is kind of in here. This is our Group 1s. Here's our Group 14s. That's our AIM and our heat and authority and things like that. There's Group 6. That's bromoxynil. We've been using that for a very long time. Here's Group 5. That's atrazine and metribuzin and things like that. Here's our Group 1. So those came on in the mid-70s, and that's our group, basically our grass-killing herbicides. And then here's our Group 10, that's Liberty. There's our Group 2s that we use an awful lot of. Some of those are grass herbicides, some of them are broadleaf herbicides, some of them are both. There's our Group 27s. Those are relatively new to us. That's our corn herbicides like our Lotus and our Armazon and Callisto and things like that, as well as our wheat herbicides like the Group 27s are in. Things like Infinity, which we've had for a very long time, and we now have on deck in Talonor as well. And then our Group 13, that's Clomazone, which is Command, which is pretty limited use span, really just for cleavers and suppression of chickweed in in soybeans, or sorry, in canola, sorry, I had a canola, sorry. And then also there is a new registration, a dry bean registration on that this year. So if you look at this, we have not had a new usable herbicide group in a very long time. This group 28 way out here, that is a new group that right now there's nothing available for us that's useful. Those are mostly rice herbicides in there. So maybe at some point there'll be something discovered that we can use, but for today, there's nothing. And there may be some new things coming down the pipe, but we are talking still years away. It's not like there's going to be something new show up available for us to use next year or even the year after that. A lot of the new things that we are hearing about are at least 3 to 5 years away. So basically, we are dealing with the same herbicides that we have been using for at least the past 40 years. Now, sometimes within these groups, there are lots of times there's different families within these groups. And if we're familiar with the group 2, we know there's 4 different families within that group 2, and they're very different from family to family. We have the IMIs, the SUs, and then we have the group that has Barrow and Everest, and then we have the group that has Simplicity and Fluoracelam in that. So there's different families, and sometimes we do get new products within that family, but at the end of the day, that's still not a new group, and that means that the way that these herbicides work in the weeds has not changed. So a new product, even a new family within an existing group, is not a new mode of action or site of action. So we're dealing with the same old, and again, that's not new. This is an older graph, but I just wanted to show you that this is kind of how resistance takes place. Basically, we've got 3 things. Basically the factors that affect the time to resistance. The level of selection is based on the efficacy of the product, the number of applications that that product's been used. So basically, how many times have we used that same product, and how much residue is left over. And we look over here about percent resistant and then the years of herbicide use. Now, these numbers are not absolute because this depends on a lot of things, right? That's a good government answer. It depends on so many things. And a lot of it is, basically there's just going to naturally be a level of selection present. There's going to be out of a million plants, there's going to be 1 or 10 or maybe even 100 that are just naturally going to be resistant because they are just genetically different. So, but we start with, when we start using these products, we start way back here on this line, on this graph, and we show that, there's basically very, very little of that percentage of that population is actually going to be resistant. But over time, as we kill all the things that are susceptible, that don't have a level of resistance, that don't have a mechanism to overcome that herbicide, over time, we are selecting for the resistant individuals, and it gradually creeps. And then all of a sudden, usually by about here, we start to see, okay, there's a problem. My herbicides aren't working. Something's wrong. You need to eliminate all the other things that it, could be, do you have the right herbicide? Was it the right staging of the weed? What were the weather conditions? Was it like even just physically a spray miss? Was it a plugged nozzle? Was it, something? When you eliminate all those, and also too, you should get testing done. When you start realizing, you have herbicide resistant, it is not very long before you get from this stage to all of a sudden here, because we've basically selected for the resistant individuals. And again, these numbers are not absolute. It's going to depend, every product's going to be different. It's going to depend on so many different things, but generally this is the type of, of curve you see. By the time you see it here, you don't have very much time because you have resistance full blown on your farm. So this is a picture here of the latest group of the herbicide-resistant weeds in the prairie region. And so this is, I would just want to put a shout out here. This is a relatively new website. This is called the Prairie Weed Monitoring Network. It is part of a series. There's the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network, where the insect pest issues are housed. And there's also the Prairie, I think it's called the Crop Disease Monitoring Network as well. So across the prairies, there's these networks where there's data and lots of information and lots of resources available for all of us when it comes to pests. And in this case, this is the Weed Monitoring Network. And so this is available there. If anybody wants it, they can download it, or I can send it to you as well. Just message me and I can send you a PDF of this. But it just shows you how many resistant weeds we currently have in the prairie region. And so here's our group 5, that would be our atrazine or our metribuzin. We've got wild mustard. Here's our group 14. We've got kochia, water hemp, and wild oat. Again, that group 14s, those are our aims, our heat, our Veraxer, our authority, our Valterra, those type of things, insights in there as well. Here's our group 1, resistant weeds, of course, green foxtail, wild oat, yellow foxtail, also foxtail barley, Persian darnel. Here's our group 9. That's our glyphosate resistant weeds. So currently on the prairies, we have 3. We have kochia, we have downy brome, and we have water hemp. This is our group 15. Currently, we just have the 1, the wild oat. This big group in here is group 2. And our group 2s, again, there's 4 different families within the group 2s. We do find there's lots of times there's a lot of cross resistance from family to family within that group 2. So once you start to get group 2 resistance on farm, pretty soon, not very many of those group 2s will work, regardless of which family they're from in that group. And we have everything. We've got grasses and broadleaf weeds in here as well. So of course we have barnyard grass, we have yellow foxtail, we have green foxtail in here, we have wild oat, obviously, and then we have a ton of broadleaf weeds as well. For group 3 resistance, that's our DNA herbicides or our yellow herbicides. That's our edge and our treflan, that type of thing. Though that's our group 3s. We do have group 3 resistant green foxtail. And now we've got, and within group 4, even though that is a very old herbicide group and we've been using that for a very long time, we still have just a few weeds in there that are resistant, and we're looking at cleavers, hemp nettle, kochia, and wild mustard. So again, if you want this resource, I can get it to you, or you can get it from that Prairie Weed Monitoring Network. And that's also the site where all of the data, I'm going to be showing you a lot of data on our last weed surveys, and that's where a lot of that data will be housed going forward. So the last time there was a full weed survey, actually I just want to show you our previous weed survey was done across the prairie provinces from 2014 to 2017. Manitoba's was done in 2016. And at that time, we can see that there was about 24 million acres, almost 24 million acres infested with herbicide-resistant weeds, and it was estimated to cost our farmers about $530 million annually. If you look at this graph here, you can see that this is Manitoba is this top line, so we're winning. This is not a race we want to win, but we consistently have always had a slightly higher level of resistance than our other counterparts in Alberta and Saskatchewan. But you can see here, going back to the surveys, we've been doing the resistance surveys in this form since the early 2000s, and you can see that resistance is just steadily increasing. And at that time, at the last time we did a prairies-wide weed survey, our last survey in 2016, our Manitoba portion, we were looking at 68% of the fields had at least one herbicide-resistant weed. And these curves, they can taper off a bit. They could even flatline, but they will never go down. Once you have herbicide-resistant weeds on farm, they are there for life. It does not go away. So at the time, I just want to talk about the weed surveys that we did. So going back as far as the 1978, they've been done in this format, so we can actually compare and contrast a lot of data over these years. So that's really, really useful to have the surveys done in this format. So we've been using the same measures basically for the last over 40 years of surveys, and we rank the weeds by relative abundance. And relative abundance is based on the relative frequency, which means how often it appears, the relative from field to field. Relative field uniformity, so within the field, how uniform is that weed, and then field density, so basically how much of that weed is in that field. And you can see in Manitoba in our survey years, over time we've increased our surveys. And in 2016, we did 659 fields. 2022, we did our survey. We did 704 fields. So I'm going to be showing you data based on our very last survey, and then some where that's moved from previous surveys. So this is basically our abundance survey, and this talks about the top 20 species in our 2022 survey. In this middle part here, all of these dots are the 704 fields that we did, and the sites were based on eco-district boundaries, and then within the eco-districts, it was based on the crops and crop density. We always do the top 6 crops in Manitoba, so that's canola, and then wheat, and then soybeans, and then after that, we've got grain corn and barley and oats, and then we also chose to do some extra surveying in 2022 because we'd never been able to have data on things like field peas, pinto beans, and sunflowers. So we did those fields as well. Again, those aren't big acre crops necessarily, or as big acre crops, and they're not necessarily as distributed across the whole province like the other ones are. So again, it's not a full data set like we're used to, but at least we have some data now. We have some baseline data on those other 3 crops. So You can see here, there's our top 10 weeds. It's green foxtail, wild buckwheat, volunteer canola, lamb's quarters, red root pigweed, yellow foxtail, barnyard grass species. There's a couple of different ones. There's very hard to tell apart. I just call them all barnyard grass. Wheat, that's volunteer wheat, wild oats, and brownleaf mallow. That's our top 10. And then when we look again over here, what we've got highlighted over here, green foxtail here, this yellow line in the middle, this line, that has basically been our #1 weed in our survey for since we've been doing the surveys in this form going back to that 1978 to 81 time period when we were doing these prairies-wide surveys. And so anything above that has increased in ranking, and anything below that has actually decreased in ranking. And again, you can see something here, bluebur at one point was on the survey, but it's really decreased. We really don't see that as an in-field weed anymore. And anything in red that has increased as something that as a weed that we've seen herbicide resistance showing up in, and anything in green that has decreased in this particular survey is a weed that has decreased in ranking, but we still know that we have herbicide resistance in that weed species. So our weed shifts, basically, I'm just going to talk about the top ones here. So basically, green foxtail since 2002 has not changed. It's always been the #1 weed that shows up in our surveys. Here's our 2022, there's 2016. And basically, I'm just showing you since 2022. That's since in the last 20 some years. And also our cropping systems changed quite a bit in the mid-90s. That's when we had herbicide tolerant crops available to us, like Roundup Ready canola, Liberty Link canola, and of course the Roundup Ready corn and soybeans started to be grown about that mid-90s. So when we look at everything in the last 20 years, we've been basically growing pretty much the same crops in that last 20 years. So that's what I'm comparing in this over here. In this column over here, sorry. And then so wild buckwheat is our #2 weed. It's moved up. Our canola has been steadily moving up, especially since since we started growing a lot more canola and a lot of herbicide tolerant canolas. You can see it is now volunteer canolas are #3 weed. There's lamb's quarters. It's moved up. And then red root pigweed is our #5 weed. And we know we do have years that some years are really bad for red root pigweed. It's a flushing weed. So some years are really bad, other years not so much. But it's always very consistently been in that top 10. Yellow foxtail has really moved up in ranking. Some of this it may have been misdiagnosed before. It may have been, people maybe had thought it was green foxtail at one point, but we are definitely seeing more yellow foxtail as well as the green foxtail. Here's barnyard grass that had decreased just a little bit since in the last 20 years. Then volunteer wheats moved up in ranking. Wild oats, now this one moved down a bit, which I was not terribly surprised at. If you remember 2022, we had a very wet spring. We had some very late seeding. A lot of crop got seeded at the very end of May and the very beginning of June. And when we seed that late, we obviously had ample moisture because it had been too wet to seed before that. And when we seed that late, our crops come up nice, and they usually come up quite well. They come up quite vigorously, and they're very competitive. And in the olden days, before we had a lot of herbicides available to us, pretty much the only thing you could do with wild oats was to seed late. And you would do cultivation, or maybe early on in the 70s and 80s when you had some burn-off products available, you would do a burn off and get rid of some of those. You would let those wild oats come up. You would terminate them with either cultivation or maybe a burn off product, and then you would seed late, and then your crop would be very competitive and get up and ahead of the wild oats. So I wasn't surprised to see that maybe fall in ranking, but as we know, it definitely has not gone away as we saw from last year. Brownleaf mallow, again, we hear a lot more about this. It has definitely moved up in rankings, and in some crops, it's becoming quite an issue. We're seeing quite a bit of brownleaf mallow. So I just had highlighted some of the ones we're going to talk about today. The grasses, obviously, that we're going to talk about. And then again, going forward, foxtail barley has moved up in ranking quite a bit. Kochia has moved up in ranking quite a bit. Smart weeds moved down a bit. Canna thistle, broadleaf plantain, dandelion, golden dock. This one I was a little surprised at. Well, not maybe. I guess maybe not too surprised. We see that in wet areas and in wet years, and I don't really think we see that. That's not really a field weed that we're terribly worried about most of the time. And then wormwood has moved up, and we do hear about that becoming an issue. It's kind of a hard one to get. A lot of it's tolerant to a lot of herbicides. It's just not an easy one to get. And then green pigweed, we've now been separating this out. In the past, it was probably just lumped in with the other pigweeds, but now it's separated out. And then the thyme leaf spurge had showed up there. And we do see that in crops sometimes, but that's really not a competitive weed. So again, just talking about some of those grasses today. But this is the stuff I really wanted to talk about. I just wanted to set that up and let you know how we get some of this data is once we've done that abundance survey, we go back and we survey a subset of those fields. So in 2022, we went back and did 155 fields from the abundance survey. And we gather the weed seeds either at or very close to harvest. And then those weed seeds are sent to Charles Geddes' lab in Lethbridge, Alberta. He's with Ag Canada. And those are grown out and they're sprayed with various herbicides. And I'm just going to talk about that going forward. So anyways, the methodology on that, how we do that. Those 155 fields are based on the cultivated area within each eco-district and the seeded area of each crop. So it's going to be proportional. And then those mature weed seeds are collected from uncontrolled visible weed patches. So we go in looking for the weeds, basically, and we estimate the patch area. And then they're sent to Alberta and they're grown out and they're grown in flats and they're watered daily. And then they're tested with group 1 and 2 herbicides. And then the herbicides are applied at the 2 to 4 leaf stage. And then they are characterized as either resistant or susceptible against known controls, so against the same species that they know are susceptible. And so basically resistant would be no injury or else injury where there's new growth, and susceptible would be dead or nearly dead. And so this is just kind of what that breakdown looks like, basically. Of course, most of the fields we're going to do is going to be in that top 6 crops. Again, there's canola was 33% of the fields, wheat's 31% of the fields, soybeans 13% of the fields. And of course, that's proportional to the amount of acres of those crops that are grown in Manitoba. And then after that, we had 9 oat fields, 5 barley fields, 5 corn fields. And we did also do some pea fields, a pinto bean field, and our sunflower field. We just did one of those, but that's less than 1% of the area. So this is, again, that breakdown of the crop as to where we found those weed seeds. And so the herbicides that are tested, it's phenoxaprop, which is Puma Advance. It's Quizalofop, basically Assure. There are other brand names, but this is the original, the trade name that was used. The tralcoxidum, that's Liquid Achieve. Clethodim, that's Centurion. Imazamox is Solo. Imazethapyr is Pursuit. Imazapyr is Arsenal. Thiophensulfuron and tribenuron is Refine. Chlorsulfuron is Teller, or the old Glean, if you remember it, known as Glean. And then glyphosate using Roundup Weather Max. And then these are the rates there. Okay, so in the survey, you can see if you look over here, we actually can see that our Manitoba, our line has tapered off just a little bit, and we are still increasing because, again, it's never going to go down. But we are sitting now at a little bit higher than we were in 2016. And this other line here, I do have this is some data from Saskatchewan at the time. I do have the Alberta data now, but I haven't showed you that just because I just wanted to concentrate on Manitoba. But basically, both Saskatchewan and Alberta in their most recent surveys have increased as well. And Saskatchewan has pretty much caught up to us, and Alberta is really close behind. So we're all sitting pretty even in the prairie provinces now for resistant weeds on farm. So in the tested fields of that 155, and you can see all the dots here, these are all the fields that we tested, and there's a lot here because the crop density is so high here in the Red River Valley and these RMs here. Of the tested fields, we found there was 80% of the tested fields had resistant weeds. When you extrapolate that to the whole province, to the approximately 10 million acres of cropland that we have, about 75% of the fields now have at least one resistant weed. When we looked at field coverage, when we're estimating how big these patches are, it's really almost half the field. So again, on about, almost half of our acres now have at least one herbicide resistant weed. And if you remember back to that picture I showed you of all the resistant weeds in Western Canada, there's just so many different weeds out there, especially in that group too. There's a lot of different species in there. So we have moved up from 68% in the 2016 survey to 75% now of our fields have at least one herbicide resistant weed, based on the 2022 survey. And based on a survey that was a follow-up survey that was done with the farmers that we sent a survey to, and they answered that, and it's estimating to cost the Manitoba farmers about $81 million annually. So talking about wild oats, you look for that black seed. It's not always black, but sometimes there's a black on there. We know we have a big ligule in the back here, and sometimes there's little hairs. And then, of course, once we see the seed head, we usually see that black on in here. But it's very, very hard to tell until you see those seed heads from tame oats. But again, sometimes if you dig it up, you can see usually if it's a black coat like this, or if it has that long black on, then for sure it's wild oats. And again, that was number 9 in the abundance survey last time. So when we look at group 1 resistance, excuse me for a sec. Pardon me. Sorry, just had a frog in my throat there. Okay, so when we look at that last our resistance survey, basically these are all the fields where we found wild oats. We don't necessarily find wild oats in all the fields, but where we do find them, where we did find them, they were 100% group 1 resistance. When we extrapolate that to, again, the whole province, we're looking at 37% of the province would have at least one group 1 resistant wild oat in the field. So we do know that that is definitely growing. And when we're looking at PAT field coverage, we're estimating that to be about 30% of the field. When we're looking at group 2 resistance, it's a little bit better. In some ways, it's about 82% of the tested fields had group 2 resistance. But when we extrapolate that to all fields across Manitoba, it's 30% of fields across all of Manitoba. So 3 out of 10 fields would have group 2 resistance. And the field coverage here would be estimated to be about a third of the field would have those wild oats on them, have presence of those wild oats. And then when you look at the ones that are both group 1 and group 2 resistant, that of the fields that we found wild oats in, 82% of them tested both group 1 and group 2, and then all fields, when you extrapolate that to all of Manitoba, that would be all fields in Manitoba, it would be about 30% of the fields would have group 1 and group 2 resistance, and again, covering about a third of those fields when you look at patch size. So what do we do when we run out of group 1s and group 2s? This one to me is one of the scariest ones. There's lots of herbicide resistant things that I worry about and I lose sleep over. But this one, the problem with this is that we really don't have any in-crop options left. When we lose, these are wheat and or barley herbicide options for group 1 and group 2 herbicide resistant wild oats. And so again, I've just got some names in here. This is not an exhaustive list of everything you could use. I've just pulled a few products out just to show you. There's Achieve, which is chalcoxidum. There's Altitude for the, or Amazamox basically for Clearfield wheat. I know we don't have very much, if any of that in Manitoba, but that is available out there. We have Avidex. So this is again to control wild oats. That is a pre, which means a pre-emerge with residual. And so that is trialate, and that used to be group 8. It's now been moved into the group 15 class. Axial, that's pinoxidin. Everest is flucarbazole, that's a 2. Axial is a 1. We have Fortress, which is a pre again, so pre-emerge, not in crop. That's trifluralin plus trialate together. Trifluralin is group 3. Horizon, Puma, Simplicity, Vero, those are group 1s, group 2s. Basically, again, if those are gone, all we have left is a couple of pre's. And if we're looking at suppression, we do have a couple more options, but again, we have nothing post that does suppression. We have Focus and Fierce, those are both pre's. This Focus is pyroxasulfone plus carfentrazone, that's AIM. And then this is actually Zidua, but that's a combo product there. And then Fierce is pyroxasulfone plus flumioxazin, that's Valterra plus Zidua. And then Olympus is a pre, that's propoxycarbazone, that's the same family as Vero and Everest, or same family within the group 2s. But again, it's a group 2. And then we also have suppression with Treflan, and that's a group 3. So if we have completely lost our group 1 and group 2 options, we have nothing post anymore. What does work well on wild oats is Roundup. Glyphosate works really well, so obviously we're not using that in crop either on wheat or barley. But where you can use it to go after wild oats, it's still a really good tool to go after those wild oats and just take those populations down. So we do know that there is resistance. There is resistance to pyroxasulfone and sulfentrazone, which is a group 14 and group 15 products. So we do know there is resistant wild oats. There's not a lot known about group 15 resistance, but it is there. And basically, this is from a paper from Hugh Becky and Neil Harker, and I'm going to show you some work from them in a minute, and talking about what do we do if we've got herbicide-resistant wild oats or herbicide-resistant weeds, what can we do? And these are kind of their top 10 steps, starting at step 10, you need to maintain a database. You have to know what was sprayed, you have to keep really good records, and you have to know. Number 9 would be strategic tillage. If, when, or where that's needed, don't give up. Don't give that up. We need to be able to use tillage, and sometimes that is the best option. It might be the only option left in some cases. Number 8, field and site-specific weed management. One size may not fit all. So again, we know we don't need to be doing the same thing on the same fields again and again and again, or if you've got like all the wheat fields across the farm, they don't necessarily, or they probably shouldn't be sprayed with just all the same products. We need to look at site-specific weed management. Be aware of weed sanitation, border control, slow the herbicide-resistant dispersal, especially if weeds are moving in from the edge of the fields. So number 6 is in-crop wheat selective herbicide rotation. This is how we combat non-target site resistance. We need to rotate our herbicide groups, so you avoid back-to-back group 1 or group 2, so you should need to alternate those. Also, number 4 would be using herbicide mixtures and sequences. Those are better than rotations, but we still want you to rotate as well, but we need to be doing both, so it's just going to get more complicated. We need to do pre and post herbicide scouting, so you need to know your enemy, what was there, what remains, and figure out exactly why is it still left over. Is it herbicide resistance? And if it is, then we need to be aware of that. And then, but these number 2 and number 1, these are things that don't involve anything basically in the spray tank, and this is competitive crops and practices that promote competitiveness. This is basically natural biological control. And the number 1 tool for combating herbicide-resistant weeds is crop diversity. So a diverse crop rotation, and then within that rotation, every single crop, grow it as competitively as possible. Make sure it's competitive. It's up out of the ground. It covers the ground quickly as it can, and keep it as healthy as possible. And that is what we need for weed control, since we don't have a lot of products anyways, and we're losing some of the products that we do have. So I want to talk to you about this study. It's an older study, but it's a good one, and it talks about what can we do other than something different in the spray tank. So this is a study out of Alberta from Neil Harker from about 20-some years ago, and they looked at a couple of different things here, 3 different things here. They looked at a continuous barley rotation versus a rotation that is barley, canola, barley, and peas. And then within each of those rotations, they looked at different competitiveness of the crops within that rotation. And they looked at, in that barley year, the cultivar using a short versus a tall cultivar. And they also looked at a low seeding rate versus a high seeding rate. So the low seeding rate would be lower than what we're normally at. The 400, this would be equal to about 20 to 40 seeds per square foot, and most of those would come up. So again, that's probably a pretty pretty thin crop, and this is a pretty heavy crop. We're probably in the middle on that, is what we're normally doing for our practices on farm. But when you look at these graphs over here, this graph, this bar here, this light blue bar, this is worst case scenario. This is a continuous barley rotation. This is a short variety seeded at a really light rate. And when we're looking at wild oat biomass at maturity, I'm not really worried about the number here. It's kilograms per hectare. I just want you to look at the scale and the proportion to the other treatments. This is our worst treatment. If we still have a low seeding rate, but we just move to a taller variety of barley, all of a sudden the wild oat biomass drops, because taller varieties are just that much more competitive. If we go to a short variety, but we seed it heavy, we're still more competitive yet, because we've got more plants out there. And the best case scenario in this rotation is a tall barley variety seeded heavy. And you can see the difference between this bar and this bar. Haven't done anything different in the spray tank. All you've done is you've made that crop a lot more competitive by changing the variety and seeding more and having more plants out there. Now, when we move to a better rotation, we've got 2, barley followed by canola, followed by barley, followed by peas in that barley year. When you look at that at the end of that 4-year rotation, this is again the worst case for barley. It's a short variety and it's seeded thin, and it's still not so we've still got a fair bit of wild oats. But when we start looking at making going to a tall variety seeded thin, and then this is a short variety but seeded heavy, and then this is our best case scenario. This is a tall barley variety seeded heavy in this rotation, and you can see the tremendous difference between the amount of wild oats in this treatment versus the amount of wild oats in this treatment. And so if you're looking at how this reduces, if you're looking at basically putting all 3 factors together, you have a 70 times reduction in wild oats biomass at maturity in that barley year. When you look at the seed production, because when we're talking about herbicide-resistant weeds, we have to be doing everything we can to reduce the amount of seed that hits the ground, and the gets replenishing that weed seed bank. So we have to do everything we can to stop the seed set. And so in this case, again, these are still the same graphs as same pattern as what we saw on the previous page. This is our worst case scenario. This is continuous barley. This is a short variety seeded really thin. And then we go all the way down here to a better rotation where we've got a tall variety of barley and it's seeded heavy. And you can see just the tremendous difference in the amount from here all the way down to here in the amount of wild oat seed production in that barley year. And when we look at put all three factors together, using a tall variety, using seeding it heavy, and then having a better rotation, you actually reduce the amount of wild oat seed by 37 times. So this has come up, and this has come up with some other things that I've talked about when I'm talking about resistant kochia and things like that. When you're trying to change different things. Sometimes you can't change everything. You might not be able to make all of those changes. But even if you can make even one change or make two changes, in this case, we were talking about just making one change, just simply switching from a lower seeding rate to a higher seeding rate in this study, or a short variety to a tall variety, or going from continuous barley to a better rotation. It reduced biomass by 2 to 3 times. And then when we are able to add in just one more thing, now we can do 2 things instead of just one, depending on what you're doing. It reduces that wild oat biomass reduction by 6 to 8 times. And in this case, in this example, when you can do all 3 things, you can reduce that wild oat biomass reduction by 19%. So again, by 19 times, sorry. So it depends on which of those you can do, but you don't necessarily, if you can't do everything, at least start doing something better, do 1 or 2 things better, and it does make a difference. So moving on to the foxtails and barnyard grass, I just have this slide up. Basically, this is where they ranked in our last abundance survey. And when you're looking at them like this, it's pretty hard to tell which one is which. You really have to get a little more up close and personal with these things, and you have to look at the auricle and ligules. Barnyard grass is easy. There's no auricle, no ligules. If you pull that back, lots of times it's pretty shiny and stuff in there, but it has no auricles, no ligules. When you're looking at the foxtails, they have this ligule in here as a fringe of hairs, and so you can see it on both of them. You can kind of see it. This is looking at it from the back side of that leaf. Here's yellow foxtail, and then with yellow foxtail, though, you also get these really fine pubescent hairs on the leaf surface as well. They're very long and silky and thin, and green foxtail does not have that. So that's the difference. That's how you tell those apart. So if you think you have a foxtail, you look for that fringe of hairs, but when you see these hairs, it's a yellow foxtail. We do have a lot of it out there. And then the seed heads look a little bit different. If you have them side by side, it's easier to tell. Green foxtail will have the smallest seed head and the smallest seed size compared to yellow foxtail. There's other foxtails as well, but compared to yellow foxtail, usually the seed head is longer and the seeds are a little bit bigger. And then green foxtail barnyard grass has just a different looking seed head on it. And there's a seed coat that stays attached to these seeds, and it's quite distinctive. Sometimes too, when you dig them up, when they're really, really small, you dig them up and you can see the seed attached. You can tell whether it was a foxtail or a barnyard grass based on that seed coat that has spines on it that barnyard grass has. So going back to our resistance survey, when we look, these are the sites here in Manitoba that were tested where we found green foxtail. We don't necessarily find it at all 155 sites. Where we found it in the tested fields, it was 88% of them had group 1 resistance. When we extrapolate that to all fields in Manitoba, that's 27%. And it was covering a fair part of the fields. Look at 72% of field coverage. So it was covering a lot of acres in Manitoba with group 1 resistance green foxtail. With group 2 resistance, we actually found in the tested fields less than 2%. And when we're looking at all fields here, it's less than 1% of all fields in Manitoba. So really not very significant at this point. When we're looking at yellow foxtail, now this has been growing of the fields where we found it, and again mostly here in the Red River Valley here or in central Manitoba. But again, we did find a little bit out further west as well, so that's just something to watch for. The tested fields, 43% of them had group 1 resistance, and that extrapolated out to Manitoba to be about 12% of all fields in Manitoba have a group 1 resistant yellow foxtail. And then we've got growing group 2 resistance. This is pretty new. And we've got 9% of the tested fields had it. Again, this is, we're generally finding it here in this region, in Manitoba, but less than 3% of fields in all of Manitoba have group 2 resistance. So once you start to see group 1 and group 2 resistant yellow foxtail, what else can we do? If you look in our guide to crop protection in the wheat tables, I'm only showing you the wheat tables here. There's obviously other products for other crops, but if you look under pre's, which is our pre-emerge products that have residual, there are products here that is fierce. Now this is for green foxtail only. This is flumioxazin pyroxasulfone. Most of that is coming from that pyroxasulfone that's got some grass weed activity. And then we've also got Focus, which is carfentrazone. And again, that pyroxasulfone, that's a group 15. Ipco bifecta is metribuzin plus flumioxazin, and together it's rated for green and yellow foxtail. If you look at Fortress, it's green foxtail only. That's triolate and trifluralin. If you look at Treflan, that's trifluralin, and then Volterra is green foxtail only, and only suppression of that's that flumioxazin. So you do get a little bit of suppression of green foxtail with that one. And one thing that you can look at now is for post-emergent is On Deck. This is a fairly new herbicide from Corteva. That is tolpyrrolate, which is group 27, and bromoxynil together. So that does have activity on green and yellow foxtails. So that is something that you can talk to your Corteva rep, talk to your retail people about starting to use that product where you are suspecting that you've got some resistant green and or yellow foxtail. So when we're moving on to barnyard grass, group 2 resistance, we've had that already in the province for a while. And again, really we've got it mostly centered here in the central part of Manitoba, but we do have some out west as well. Of where we found barnyard grass in these fields, it was 86% of it was group 2 resistant, and that extrapolates out to about 29% of the province-wide is group 2 resistant. But there also are some new herbicide-resistant grass weeds. So they've been confirmed in this study, but in order to actually confirm them, they need to do what they call dose-response experiments. So basically more doses of the same products and higher doses to see exactly how resistant these weeds are. But they were confirmed in this study that there was some new herbicide resistance showing up. So barnyard grass, we now have group 1 resistance showing up. That is new. Where we found it, it was showing up in about a third of the fields where we found it, and that extrapolates out to about 11% of group 1, 11% of fields in Manitoba would have group 1 resistant, while group 1 resistant barnyard grass. So when you look at group 1 and 2 resistance together, then of the fields where we found it, then we had about 37% of that, and that was about 12% of the fields in Manitoba would be estimated to have group 1 and group 2 resistant barnyard grass. So what else can we do once we start seeing group 1 and group 2 resistant barnyard grass? Again, if you go to your tables in the front of the guide to crop protection, when you look at the pre-products, what's listed under pre, we've got Fierce and Focus and Ipco bifecta. And again, so we've got some group 14s, group 15s in there, so some different groups in there. And when you're looking post, when it comes to barnyard grass control, On Deck has it listed. Now that's I don't think that's in the guide this year, but their label has seen some updates. And so on their label, there has actually been quite a few more weeds added on. So that's something that you may not see in the guide, but it is actually on their label. And then any product containing haloxifin. This is a neat one. It's a group 4 product. And generally, we think of our group 4 products as broadleaf herbicides. But haloxifin is very unique, and it actually does barnyard grass on its own. So any product that has haloxifin in it, so these are the Corteva products. That's Exhilarate, Extinguish, Pixaro, Prominex, Rexaid, Resivent. I may have missed one or two. I hope I haven't. But anyways, look for this product, anything containing haloxifin, and that will do a really good job on your barnyard grass control. So you need to be looking at, these are broadleaf products actually. This tolpyrrolate and this haloxifin, again, those are broadleaf products, but they do have some grass activity. So that's really good to have those in our toolbox that we can use. A couple new ones here just to finish off. I've got stink grass, and this one is pretty new. I've been really seeing a lot of this lately. I don't know how competitive this is, but this is something that I think we need to keep an eye out on. I really only found it in a few places. I have seen quite a bit of it here in central Manitoba, but not so much. I don't really know how competitive it is. But again, it's something that we have to keep an eye on, and it's something that we don't see on a lot of labels. It's just not there. I have seen that on the Treflen label, I believe, but not, but at the higher rates on that Treflen in the canola and oilseed rates type thing. But we do see group 1 resistance where we found it, which was really only a few sites. And again, we did find it through here, through southern Manitoba, southwestern Manitoba as well. And we did find that 33% of where it was places where the sites that we found it, it was resistant. But basically, when we extrapolate that to all of Manitoba, it's really 3% of the fields would be estimated to have that. So again, just something to keep in mind. When we're looking at quackgrass, where we found it, it was really only in a couple of spots. You can see them here. But where it was found, it was 100% of them were resistant to group 1 and group 2. Extrapolating that to all fields in Manitoba, that is less than about 1% of the fields in Manitoba, but that's just something to be aware of. But again, normally quackgrass, that's a perennial weed, and hopefully going after that with something like a glyphosate pre-harvest or fall weed control or something like that is where we're going to have a good success with that. So I just want to talk quickly about the glyphosate-resistant downy brome in Canada. This is significant. This is our first glyphosate-resistant grass in Western Canada. There is a glyphosate-resistant Italian ryegrass in Eastern Canada. We do not have that here. However, it showed up in Eastern Canada after road construction had been done and the ditches had been revegetated, and it showed up in those seed mixtures that were used for that purpose. So any of these weeds that are resistant elsewhere could show up like that as well, but that's not something that we normally have here anyways, unless it was to show up like it did in Ontario. But downy brome, we know we've had that on the landscape here in Western Canada for quite a long time. And so this is our first glyphosate-resistant grass. And so up here, this is some work that was done in Alberta from Charles and his crew, Charles Geddes and his crew. And so we see we've got a couple susceptible varieties in here. And if you're looking, this is, normally the rate. This is that half a liter, and this is that liter of glyphosate that we would normally be using for burn-off or for weed control. And so you can see on susceptible populations, that's working really well. Maybe a little bit of greening here on that half a liter rate, but here's that 1 liter rate. But on this resistant population, you can see that it's really not working. And if you look at these rates, now these are in grams per hectare, but you can see this is a dose response study that I talked about. This needs to be done when we find new resistances. This is the work that Dr. Geddes at Ag Canada does. And you do these, everything from 0 all the way up to really, really high rates. And you can see this is a half a liter, this is 1 liter, this is 2 liters, this is 4 liters, it just goes up and up and up. And so you need to see, this helps them determine the level of resistance that's in that particular weed. And so again, that was the rates that we'd normally be using in crop. And you can see based on this graph out here, these are the two susceptible. You don't need to worry about the numbers down here, but when these two, this red and this black are the susceptible varieties, and this blue one is the resistance. And the further out this graph is, basically the more resistance it is. It's just, it's resistant to the fact that we're not going to be using rates like this to control this weed, because that's just not economical. It's just not practical or economical. So when we're looking at downy and Japanese control in wheat, this is a busy slide. There's kind of lots on here, but there's really not very much. When we're looking in pre, there are some listed for pre. When you're looking at fierce, and J means Japanese only. And we have, most of our products seem to do a better job on Japanese than they do on downy. But to my knowledge, as far as I know, we don't have any resistant Japanese or glyphosate-resistant Japanese brome yet. It's just downy brome at this point. But we have fierce, which is flumioxazin plus this pyroxasulfone. We have focus, which is AIM plus this pyroxasulfone. Again, you're getting that pyroxasulfone is what's working here. And then IPCO bifecta. This is actually downy brome only, which is metribuzin and flumioxazin. You are getting some coming from that flumioxazin. We also have Olympus, which is pre, and that's proproxycarbazone. That's a group 2. So we are getting some control here. And then with post, basically, we're looking at our group 2 herbicides. Our group 1s really are not working at all. And our group 1s, basically, we've got Erebus Supreme, we've got control of Japanese, but suppression of downy, and really it's this pyroxylem, which is simplicity. So basically you can see in all of this, I'll go through all of them, but basically pyroxylem's in most of these. And so Rexaid, you get control of Japanese, suppression of downy, it's pyroxylem, again, plus some broadleaf products there. Simplicity itself, which again is control of Japanese and suppression of downy brome, that's pyroxylem. Tandem, which has simplicity Simplicity in it, Tridem, which has Simplicity in it, and then we get to Vero, which is a different group 2 and a different family of group 2s. But again, it is still a group 2. So again, we're really not, our group 1s are not getting us anything, doing anything for our annual bromes here. We need to be using a group 2. With Vero on its own, it's Japanese only and it's only suppression. With Vero FX, we get Japanese only, and we get suppression from the overwintering ones because Downy and Japanese brome are either spring annuals or winter annuals. They tend to be mostly winter annual weeds, actually. I'm not sure how much of them come in the spring, but I guess some will. But you will get control of the spring germinated, and then with Velocity, which is again Vero plus Infinity, basically, you do get Japanese only and only suppression of that. So again, we do have some products, but basically Simplicity or products that Simplicity are in are going to get you your best level of control for your Japanese and then suppression of Downy brome. So just a thank you to everybody who contributed to the weed surveys, which was Pulse and Soybean Growers, Canola Growers, Crop Alliance, Manitoba Government, Sask Wheat, Western Grains, and then Alberta Grains as well, and then the governments, Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan governments have contributed to the studies. And then I just want to list a couple of websites here. If you're interested in some of the graphs that I've shown, they're available on this Herbicide Resistant Action Committee website. There's lots of graphs available on there, and there's lots of information if you're looking for something specific on a specific herbicide resistance issue. There's loads of information there. It's worldwide information, but again, it's a really great resource if you're looking for anything on that. This is another really good site. This is called Grow. This is called Getting Rid of Weeds. This is just a screenshot from their webpage. And it's getting rid of weeds through integrated weed management. And it's basically, they're a scientist-led network that coordinate research. They help farmers across the U.S. fight herbicide resistance with a greater diversity of weed control strategies to complement chemical use. So it's not chemistry-based, but it's lots of other things. So there's lots of things here on cover crops, increased crop competition, harvest weed seed control, lots of information there. So that's a really good website to visit as well. And then finally, the Weed Smart site in Australia. It's very practical, very farmer focused. Australia has been dealing with resistant weeds for as long as we have, or longer than we have probably, and they are worse than us. And so, although we're not that far behind, and so there's lots of stuff. And just to be aware that when you look at websites from other places, like from the US and from Australia, they do have products that we don't have here. And so sometimes, some of those recommendations, obviously we can't use them, but take what you like, leave the rest. And again, there's lots of information on this site. And I do like the Weed Smart site, especially when it comes to the harvest weed seed control. Lots of information on there, and lots of really good farmer testimonials, and lots of farmer tips and tricks as well on this website. So it's a good one. So that is all I have. If we have any questions, I think there's still time for questions, or we could just go to the panel if there's questions for them.
Okay, thanks, Kim. And just wanted to ask one or two questions. First of all, when you talk about, when I talk to a lot of times with producers and they get, say, wild oat resistance showing up in their field, it's not complete through the whole field, but it's really bad in patches. And managing those patches without a product, what would be your recommendation? Like you get some of those low areas that are just all wild oats, and it keeps coming and coming.
Yeah, like it's like a carpet. So the seed bank in there is just huge. So the thing is to stop the bleeding, I guess, is stop the hemorrhaging at this point, and try and don't let those patches go to seed anymore. So whatever you have to do to get rid of those patches, and hopefully they're in an area that you could get at them. Basically, you're going to have to go in, and you're going to have to, when those wild oats do come and they're resistant, you really need to be mowing those down or cultivating if you can, trying to limit the amount of seed that's returning to the seed bank because those are resistant weeds. If you put a combine through those patches, normally, what you're doing is spreading that. When we talk about harvest weed seed management, there's lots of different things you can do, starting with, chaff wagons and going all the way up to harvest weed seed destructors. And so what those can do too, even though wild oats is a plant that drops a lot of seed before harvest, what it can do is help you with patch management on those as well, and not expand the edges of those patches, because whatever wild oats are, whatever wild oats have dropped to the ground are on the ground, and then whatever's still on the plant, you do some type of harvest weed seed management, whether, like I said, whether through chaff collection or chaff lining. That's where you would do whatever you want with the straw, but you bring your chaff down into you funnel it down into like a row, and then you can do whatever you want. If in places where they do controlled traffic farming, they put that in behind the wheel, and it just stays there because crop is never grown because the wheel tracks are permanent. But most of us aren't doing that. And in that case, you would just drop it into a row and then probably just light a match. As long as you're not doing tillage and spread them around again, they'll kind of rot. They can rot in those strips in the field. Those strips of chaff can rot a bit if they're wet at all. They can, they're like a mulch in there. But you can also, when they're dry enough, light a match and burn some of the weed seeds that way. So do whatever you can to not let those patches set any more seed, because you've got to not contribute to that seed bank. And then if there are still products you can use, like again, we're using those things like Avidex or some of our pre's, use those products as well. But be aware that when wild oats do come through on those, because those are, they're not as, I'm not going to say they're not as good a product, but we don't see the efficacy that we used to see with when we had like our group 1s and our group 2 products. When they worked really, really well. And so some of our other products, we don't necessarily get as good weed control with them, but we still get some type of weed control. So we do need to use those products.
Okay, thanks, Kim. And we'll probably have you on again before we get too busy in the field. So I'd like to thank you for that good update today. It looks like we got a pretty major problem in some areas, especially with some of our wild oats control products. And hopefully there's something in the horizon that's going to come out and give us a hand.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, maybe not right away. There could be things coming down the pipe, but for the next few years anyways, we've got what we've got. And so we need to use those. And again, at the end of the day, Roundup, glyphosate is still a really good tool. Use it where you can on wild oats. It's a very good grass killer. Again, the only grass that we have resistance to in Western Canada is downy brome. And so it would be unfortunate if you had that, usually where you have your wild oats, and I don't think we do, but not necessarily. But again, where you can use glyphosate on those wild oats, use it, because it does a really good job at cleaning them up as well.
Okay, good. Thanks, Kim. So just a few slides to finish off the day here. Just a reminder that the crop scouting panel is going to be coming back again this year. So we'll be working, I think we'll probably get started on the 16th of April with our summer cropping crop talks, which will happen on a weekly basis. So our crop scouting panel will be back again. Here's the crop extension specialist list of us working in the province, our locations, and our contact numbers. So if you ever have any questions or need some information, feel free to give any one of these people a call. Our livestock specialists, where some areas are getting to the end of calving, some areas are just ramping up calving. So if you got questions regarding herd health, don't be afraid to give any one of these people a call. Also, remember that Stock Talk is happening, and the next one is on March the 13th, and it'll be on. So if you're interested, you can register there for Stock Talk. Our MASC service offices, again, we're getting closer and closer to spring. So if you're making some seeding decisions, or you're picking up some more land, or you're wanting to try some new crops, definitely give the offices a call to see what your coverages there will be, and if you're adding acres, so they know that you're doing that beforehand. And if you got questions, there's my contact information, Lori's contact information, and join us on April 16th for the start of the growing season. And we'll see you then.